Mercantilism was not born in classrooms or treatises. It was born on battlefields and shipyards, and inside royal treasuries, where rulers counted coins and measured power in silver weight. Long before economics became a science, mercantilism functioned as instinct, a belief that wealth was finite, that nations competed for a fixed pile of riches, and that survival depended on taking more than one gave. In this worldview, trade was not cooperation, it was combat by other means. To understand mercantilism, one must abandon modern assumptions about growth. Early modern states did not believe prosperity could expand indefinitely. They believed it could only be captured, defended, and hoarded. Gold and silver were not symbols of wealth. They were wealth. They paid soldiers, built ships, and financed wars. A nation without bullion was a nation without defense. Economic policy, therefore, became a branch of military strategy. The rise of mercantilism coincided with the rise of the modern state. As medieval feudal systems fragmented, monarchs sought centralized power. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Navies replaced castles. These innovations required constant funding. Taxation alone was insufficient. Trade had to serve the state, and the state had to control trade. Mercantilist doctrine emerged organically from this need. Exports were encouraged because they brought bullion in. Imports were restricted because they drained it out. Colonies existed not as partners, but as reservoirs of raw materials and captive markets. Manufacturing was protected. Shipping was regulated. Monopolies were granted to loyal companies. Economic freedom was not a virtue, it was a vulnerability. England's Navigation Acts exemplified this logic. Trade routes were weaponized. Only English ships could carry goods to English ports. Colonial commerce was tightly controlled. The goal was not efficiency, but dominance. Commerce became an extension of war, fought with tariffs instead of cannons. France pursued mercantilism with even greater rigor under Jean-Baptiste Colbert. The state intervened aggressively in production quality control and trade balances. Industries were subsidized, imports taxed, luxury goods promoted as national achievements. Colbert did not seek free markets, he sought a strong state. And for a time it worked. France's industrial capacity expanded. Revenues increased. Power consolidated. Spain offers the cautionary mirror, flush with silver from the Americas. Spain embodied mercantilist obsession with bullion, but neglected productive capacity. Inflation surged. Domestic industry withered. Wealth flowed in and out without anchoring growth. Mercantilism without production proved hollow. Bullion alone could not sustain power. This reveals mercantilism's central contradiction. It recognized that power required resources, but misunderstood how resources multiplied. By focusing on accumulation rather than productivity, mercantilist states often stifled the very innovation they needed. Protection bred inefficiency. Monopolies bred complacency. Regulation froze industries in time. Yet mercantilism was not irrational. In a world of constant war and fragile institutions, it was adaptive. Markets could not be trusted to supply weapons reliably. Foreign dependence was dangerous. Strategic industries required protection. In this sense, mercantilism was realism masquerading as economics. Colonial empires became the laboratory of mercantilism. Colonies supplied cheap inputs and absorbed finished goods. Their development was deliberately constrained to avoid competition with the metropole. This arrangement enriched imperial centers while impoverishing peripheries. It also sowed the seeds of rebellion. When colonies realized they were instruments rather than partners, resistance followed. The American Revolution was at its core a mercantilist crisis. No taxation without representation was also no trade without autonomy. By the 18th century, Mercantilism dominated European policy, but cracks had appeared. Smuggling flourished where tariffs were high. Innovation lagged where monopolies ruled. Wealth concentrated among court-connected merchants rather than dynamic producers. The system preserved power, but not dynamism. Into this world stepped critics who observed something mercantilism could not explain. Societies grew richer not by hoarding metal, but by producing more. Trade could benefit both sides. Wealth was not fixed, it was expandable. These ideas would later be articulated by Adam Smith, but they existed first as observation, not ideology. Still, mercantilism did not vanish overnight. Empires do not abandon doctrines that serve power easily. Even as free trade rhetoric spread, mercantilist instincts endured. Strategic protection, industrial policy, and trade wars resurfaced whenever security felt threatened. Mercantilism, it turned out, was less a theory than a reflex. Standing in a 17th century port, watching ships unload spices, sugar, and silver under armed guard, one understands mercantilism's emotional core. It was fear dressed as policy, the fear of scarcity, invasion, and decline. It promised certainty in an uncertain world. It replaced trust with control. The enduring importance of mercantilism lies not in its failure, but in its persistence. Every era that feels threatened, rediscover its logic. When globalization strains, when supply chains fracture, when rivals rise, nations revert to mercantilist language, strategic industries, trade balances, economic sovereignty. The vocabulary changes, the instinct remains. Mercantilism shaped the world by teaching states how to organize economies for power rather than welfare. It built navies, empires, and treasuries. It also constrained growth, fueled conflict, and delayed understanding of how wealth truly expands. It was the childhood of economic policy, protective, suspicious, and obsessed with control. As history moved forward, mercantilism would be challenged, dismantled, and reinterpreted. But it would never disappear. It would retreat into the background, waiting for moments of stress to re-emerge under new names. Understanding mercantilism is therefore not about studying a dead doctrine. It is about recognizing a recurring mindset, one that resurfaces whenever nations believe the world has become too dangerous to trust a mindset that prioritizes security over efficiency, accumulation over innovation, and dominance over cooperation. A mindset whose consequences history has recorded repeatedly in cycles of growth and stagnation, power and decline cycles that would only become clearer as mercantilism gave way to new economic philosophies that promised prosperity without conquest. Philosophies that would redefine wealth itself and challenge the zero-sum logic that had governed empires for centuries, a challenge that would reshape global trade finance and political economy. In ways that mercantilist rulers could scarcely imagine, a transformation that would begin when thinkers dared to ask whether wealth could grow rather than be seized, a question that would force a reckoning that would redefine how nations understood wealth power and the purpose of economic policy itself. For once, the question was asked whether prosperity could be created rather than captured. The intellectual foundations of mercantilism began to crack. The late 18th century marked the turning point. Thinkers like Adam Smith did not merely criticize mercantilism, they exposed its hidden cost. By treating trade as war and wealth as finite, mercantilist states had confused power with productivity. They had mistaken control for strength. Smith observed what dockworkers, artisans, and merchants already knew intuitively. Specialization, exchange, and competition expanded output in ways bullion hoarding never could. Wealth grew when incentives were aligned with efficiency, not when borders were sealed by fear. As these ideas spread, mercantilism retreated, but it did not vanish. It transformed. Tariffs fell, yet industrial policy remained. Empires loosened trade, yet guarded strategic sectors. The 19th century's embrace of free trade coexisted uneasily with colonial domination and naval enforcement. Mercantilism shed its explicit language, but retained its instincts. The 20th century revived those instincts under new pressures. World wars revalidated state control of trade capital and production. Governments rationed resources, directed industry, and treated economic capacity as military capability. In these moments, mercantilism returned, not as doctrine, but as emergency logic. Survival demanded coordination. Efficiency was secondary to security. Even after war, mercantilist reflexes lingered. The Cold War framed economic systems as ideological weapons. Industrial capacity, technological leadership, and trade surpluses were measures of national strength. Japan's export-driven model, Europe's agricultural protections, America's defense industrial complex all bore mercantilist DNA adapted to a modern world. Globalization appeared to bury mercantilism under efficiency and integration. Yet crises revived it instantly. The Asian financial crisis supply chain, shocks trade wars, and geopolitical fragmentation revealed how quickly nations revert to zero-sum thinking when vulnerability is exposed. Strategic autonomy replaced comparative advantage in policy language. Economic security became a national priority. History teaches that mercantilism never truly disappears because it addresses a permanent anxiety dependence. When nations fear reliance on others for food, energy, technology, or finance, they reach for control. Mercantilism offers psychological comfort even when it imposes economic cost. The final lesson of mercantilism is therefore not condemnation, but clarity. It reminds us that economic ideas are shaped less by theory than by fear. Mercantilism flourishes when trust collapses. It fades when confidence returns. Understanding it allows societies to recognize when protection becomes paralysis, when security strangles innovation, and when power pursued through accumulation undermines the growth it seeks to defend. If this journey through mercantilism reshaped how you see trade wars, industrial policy, or modern economic nationalism, share what resonated most with you. And if you want to continue exploring how ancient economic instincts resurface in modern financial systems, follow the channel and stay with this story, because history never repeats itself exactly, but it rhymes loudly whenever fear begins to dictate policy.